Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Arun Jaitley's first budget and its implications and ramifications continue to dominate the news. In part two, his deputy Nirmala Sitharaman, the Minister of State for Finance, will respond to the criticisms and concerns raised by the budget. But first, how has Mr. Jaitley's budget been received by international investors and the outside world? Given its enormous stress on FDI and PPP, their response could be critical to its success. So in part one, we ask American and European journalists, businessmen and academics how they view the Modi government's first budget. And now joining me to discuss how the budget is likely to be received by foreign investors is the Wall Street Journal's India correspondent Gordon Fairclough, the South Asia correspondent of the Financial Times Amy Kasmin, the well-known British peer and former LSE professor Lord Meghnad Desai, and joining us from Paris, the French government's foreign trade advisor Nicolas Riboulet. Amy Kasmin, let me begin by asking you for your broad assessment of the budget before I come down to details and specifics. In your eyes, was it a good budget or did it fail to live up to expectations?
I think expectations of this budget were sky high. So to be honest, it would have been difficult probably for any budget to live up to those expectations. Nevertheless, I do think there's a feeling that the budget kind of laid out a good direction, but there's a concern about the lack of details about how they're going to achieve some of the goals that they've set out for themselves. I think investors were broadly happy with what they heard in terms of like a letter of intent, but I think they would have liked a bit more detail about how the government intended to get there.
Gordon Fairclough, your paper, the Wall Street Journal, has a lot of people who read it to follow what's happening in India, both in this country and abroad.
Indeed.
What did you pick up as the main idea or item in this budget?
Well, really our sense was from investors and business people that we've talked to was one of being underwhelmed. As Amy said, I think expectations were really sky high. I think there were hopes that we would have seen more discussion of particulars, what was going to happen with subsidies, broader moves on foreign investment than we actually did see. So I think in those ways, a lot of people were a bit underwhelmed.
Nicolas Riboulet, sitting in Paris and being the French government's advisor on foreign trade, when you heard that budget, did you believe it had a central idea? And if it didn't have a central idea, was that cause for disappointment?
Well, I think the directions that have been set are clear and are in line with what the BJP is expected. Of course, there's no revolution in this budget. So from that point of view, I think there were some expectations about big changes, and we don't see that. But I think all the directions that are set by this budget are very clear, and all the points that are in the budget are fine. I think they put in place an environment for business that is looking more business friendly. I mean, about tax litigation, transfer pricing, even about the retrospective application. I know that some investors were disappointed about the content, but I think overall, I think we should be satisfied with the direction set by the budget. More could be done, but the directions are fine.
Lord Desai, let me quote Claude Samja from today's Business Standard. He says, the right message has been sent. Now, as a former LSE professor, someone who understands Britain and British investors very well, do you agree the right message has been sent? And if you do, what is that right message?
I think there is a message, but that was not the message the market was expecting. The market wanted a much stronger affirmation of sort of Thatcherite philosophy or right-wing philosophy, or whatever you call that. And I think either because the government did not have the time to make up its mind about the radical proposals, and therefore we had to wait till February for the fully radical proposals, or it may be that the BJP is actually not a Thatcherite party. It is a very mainstream Indian party, right of the UPA, but not all that much right. And what the message being given was that, we are just like you, we're just like Congress, but a little bit better. a little bit more decisive, a little bit more interested in infrastructure and sort of the Hindu holy places and all that. But don't worry, there's not going to be radical change.
So in a nutshell, what you're saying,
But
Lord
if
Desai,
it was the first,
what you're saying in a nutshell is that there wasn't satisfaction for the market yesterday. They either have to wait till February, or they may never be satisfied if the BJP turns out to be a party that differs with the Thatcherite view the market hoped the BJP had adopted. That's what you're saying. No satisfaction today.
no satisfaction today, perhaps satisfaction tomorrow.
All right.
But keep your fingers crossed.
Amy Casman, let's start with some specifics, and let's begin with what Mr. Jaitley has done about the retrospective taxation problem, which really worried international investors enormously. Now, first of all, as regards Vodafone, and that is, by the way, 12 or 14 similar companies bunched up together, they're all in litigation or arbitration, and as far as their problems are concerned, the government has come up with no solution or relief. It simply decided it will await the outcome and accept the verdict, whatever it is. What message does that send foreign investors? Because that problem is unresolved.
I think it sends a slightly complicated message. I do think Mr. Jaitley, in his comments on the retrospective tax issue, was attempting to send a very strong message to the global investment community and foreign companies that the BJP would not pursue similar kinds of taxes and not make similar kinds of claims against companies. At the same time, I think there was hope maybe among some foreign businesses for a possible repeal of the retrospective taxes. That hasn't happened, so it remains on the books. He's talked about setting up a high-level committee that would scrutinize any fresh cases that any tax official might think about bringing under the terms of this law. So it still leaves it open to the books, on the books. And meanwhile, the Vodafone case and the case of other companies that have, in good faith, made investments in the real economy in India will have this still hanging over their heads. And I think that leaves it in a slightly uncomfortable position. You sort of have to take this government's word for it that they're not going to go after you for similar claims, but it doesn't really, it leaves it on the books, and so you think it could come back if another administration thinks differently.
Gordon Fackloff, I want to pick up on that last point, because although Mr. Jaitley in his interviews yesterday evening went out of his way to keep saying there would be no fresh instances of retrospective taxation under the 2012 amendment, on the other hand, the truth is he's authorized the CBDT to set up a committee that will actually look into and handle fresh cases. So what it actually means is that an assessing officer on his own can't issue a notice, but if the CBDT committee concurs, then it can be issued. And there's no guarantee the CBDT committee will always say no. So that's another cause for concern, would you say?
That's exactly right. And Mr. Jaitley also went out of his way in the budget speech to say that it's the sovereign right of India to impose retroactive taxes, while saying that his government would not ordinarily do that. But I think there you have the situation where investors, of course, who are looking to come in are looking at being in India for many, many years, certainly well past the duration of this administration. And if those laws remain on the books, and this kind of tribunal remains in the books, they don't have the kind of certainty that they would like for taxation.
So just to sum up, if I understand the two of you together, and you represent perhaps the two most important financial papers in the world, the FT in Amy's case and the Wall Street Journal yours, you're both saying that in fact the resolution of this problem is not a resolution. The law still remains on the book. You have to trust the minister when he says it won't be used, but he's left a mechanism for it to be used if it has to be used, and so doubts and questions remain. Am I right?
I think for companies there is still a level of doubt there, and that it was something that they had been hoping that would get cleared up with some finality.
He's basically asking companies to take it on faith that the government won't use this law, which will, though, remain on the books. And it's an interesting issue because India has lots of archaic laws on the books that are discouragements to investment, and every once in a while some really old law is dragged out from the closet and used to prosecute companies. So I think he's asking companies to take it on faith, to have confidence in this government and its intentions, but the lawyers might have something else to say about it.
Lord Desai, Mr. Jaitley went out of his way to say that he can't abridge what he called Parliament's sacrosanct right to make retrospective amendments. But equally, I put it to you, Parliament has a sacrosanct right to change its mind. So why couldn't this Parliament in 2014 have said that the amendment passed in 2012 would be prospective and not retrospective, and that would have ended the matter? And what I'm proposing would not have been an abridgment or an amendment of sacrosanct powers, simply a different way of exercising those powers. Do you think that could have been a solution that would have met the concerns of foreign investors more effectively?
I think that would have been, and Mr. Jaitley, being a lawyer, would have perfectly understood what had to be done. But I think you have to look at the politics of this. See, there is a drought on, and there is a very high rate of inflation. In the first 45 days, the government is feeling under attack, and they were suspected of being friends of crony capitalists. And I think the way Narendra Modi has moved, for example, on the gas price issue, that he is basically saying, no, I'm nobody's friend right now.
Okay.
I'm not a friend of my crony capitalist, and I'm not going to roll over to foreign capitalists either. Even if I think that the Vodafone case was bad and retrospective legislation is not good, you know, this is a right nationalist government. UP was a left nationalist government. And so the national problem of my sovereignty as against foreign capital is what Jaitley was referring to. Now, again, as I said before, things were improved by February.
Well, that's a hope I have to point out. We have no guarantee it will. Let me bring you in at that point, Nicholas. You've heard Lord Desai argue that perhaps it was the politics and the way a repeal or an amendment was viewed in India that possibly restrained the finance minister's hand. Now, that explanation may not work with British investors and American investors because they're deeply concerned about this retrospective law and the way it's affected their companies. How is this issue viewed in France? How does it affect French companies, and what view do French CEOs take of this matter?
I think no entrepreneur, no company likes retrospective amendments of tax legislation. So I think that was seen, and I think that was one very critical issue with the former government and the perception of India by foreign investors, including French investors and probably all European investors as well. So I think that's a concern. In respect of what could be done in this budget, or what could have been done, I think was difficult from a technical and from a political point of view to just to go back and to say that they would be cancelling these 2012 retrospective amendments. So I think what has been done here is probably reasonable at this stage. It's probably only halfway of what most of the investors were expecting. But for me, the key message is the commitment that is made by BJP and by the finance minister about not making that type of retrospective amendments anymore. I think that's the important message.
Do you in France believe that commitment, despite the fact there is a CBTT mechanism put in place to actually go into such fresh cases were they to arise? Do you believe that commitment?
The problem, I think time will tell. It's from my point of view today. I give credit to the new government about the commitments that they are making. There's no reason why I think we should have doubts about this government, about being more business friendly and trying to revive the interest of foreign investors for India. A lot of things that are in this budget are going to that direction as well. So I'm not too concerned with that at this stage.
Amy Kasman, let's move on. Mr. Jaitley has also opened up FDI insurance and defense to 49%, but with the proviso that the companies have to be fully Indian managed and controlled. Will this appeal to foreign investors, or will the full Indian management requirement be a little bit of a stumbling block?
Once again, I think that this is an area where the budget maybe fell short of expectations and hopes. On one hand, of course, it's great if foreign equity can be raised in these sectors. On the other hand, for companies to really make big investments, and especially in sensitive sector like defense and defense technology, I think they really will want to be assured of management control. So it's really hard to say how many companies will take advantage of that opportunity. I think maybe if a foreign partner has an Indian joint venture partner that they've been working with and really has a lot of confidence in, perhaps they might be willing to take that risk. But it's not quite as comfortable for them as it would be if they were given that 51%.
Gordon Fairclough, specifically with defense manufacturers and those that have high-level major technologies to offer, would they be inclined to commit such technologies to a company, a joint venture in India where they have only 49% and not 51% control? Or would that absence, critical absence of 2%, which gives them control, say, it's a no-no for us?
My guess is that would make them very nervous. Obviously the ability to have management control, especially when you're bringing with you proprietary technologies and things like that, is pretty critical for company managers. So I think that would probably be a discouragement. Of course, India is planning a lot of defense purchasing. India is the world's biggest arms importer. There's obviously a big business there, and that might be enough of a lure to get some companies to swallow some of their reservations and take the plunge.
You mean it could work with some, but it won't work with all?
That would be my guess.
Nicholas Ohibola, Mr. Jaitley's initiatives to boost infrastructure rely particularly heavily on what are called in India PPP arrangements. Similarly, the railway minister's Diamond Quadrilateral relies heavily on FDI. Do you think French companies would be attracted and would respond favorably, or would the experience of PPP in India tend to put French companies off?
I think honestly, what is in the budget is positive for infrastructure and PPP. However, what you have to consider today is the reasons why there were some issues or lack of investment on some of the PPP project and some of the infrastructure. And I think a lot of the issues today lie not only in the hand of the central government, but also in the state governments and in all the red tape around the projects, as well as all the difficulties around the bidding process and the competition. So I think a lot of the things that are factors that should be modified are outside of this budget. So it's areas where the central government has some impact, but I would not expect that it's the central budget that would really be the only key driver for that. So what we expect, I think, from an investor's point of view is changes in terms of all the overall environment and red tape, what's going on in terms of the state government as well. So there's a lot more that should be there to fully revive infrastructure. I think BJP is and the new government is committed to that, so hopefully things will move on.
Now, Lord Desai, there's a huge amount of disinvestment that's going to happen over the next 8 months and thereafter during the next 4 years of this government. 63,000 crore over the next 8 months. And then, of course, the banks are going to be selling their shares as they recapitalize themselves. Do you think there'll be a big response from Western mutual and pension funds, particularly since Mr. Jaitley has also given them some favorable tax terms?
Yeah, I think FII has no problems. The markets are buoyant despite what they did yesterday, and I think there would be optimism on things like infrastructure investment. The economy is going to grow, and so if the government start divesting shares in banks or Coal India or whatever it is, market will buy it. So I think on this investment program, I'm very optimistic that Jaitley will achieve his difficult target.
Okay. Let's then come at that point, Amy Kasmin, to Mr. Jaitley's handling of the Indian economy. In time's running out, so I'll ask both of you for shorter answers. He's accepted Mr. Chidambaram's fiscal deficit target of 4.1. He's then set a roadmap which goes through 3.6 to 3 in 2 years' time. Will outside investors be impressed, or will they say to themselves, with the poor monsoon looming on the horizon, with an oil crisis possibly developing in the Middle East, this is unattainable, and we've got serious question marks about it?
I think they might actually say both. I think they're impressed that he's trying to stick to that target, even though they think it might be a little unrealistic and it might be difficult for him to meet it. On the other hand, I think they prefer that than him revising the target upwards a little bit and then say, we'll meet that, and then slip on an even higher revised target. So that's it.
Now, one of the big concerns Western investors have about India is the ballooning size of the subsidy bill. And it's been something that people talk about constantly. Mr. Jaitley has decided to appoint what he calls an expenditure management committee that will look into both expenditure and subsidy. Will Western investors view that as a credible response to a serious problem that's difficult to tackle politically? Or will they say, this is just an avoidance mechanism, he's kicking it down the road but not doing anything about it?
I think people understand that there are political limits on what a government can do 6 weeks in or so. That said, I think people were hoping for a bit more in terms of clues, in terms of the way the government plans to handle subsidies in the future. Mr. Jaitley said that they would be overhauled, that they would be made more targeted. But as we've seen, subsidy levels have stayed fairly the same, and Rega even got a bit of a boost in
fact,
the budget.
subsidies overall have gone up since the interim budget.
Indeed. That coupled, however, though, with Mr. Jaitley's insistence on sticking to the deficit targets and raising revenue to pay for what the government is spending, I think does give people some comfort.
Very quickly, Nicolas Ribolet, because time is against us, Mr. Jaitley began his budget by saying that the budget was the most comprehensive action plan. And yet, he said absolutely nothing about labour laws or about land acquisition. And both of those are issues the BJP is committed to. It's committed to one in its manifesto. Its ministers are talking about the other. Yet there was complete and total silence in the budget. Did that disappoint you?
No, not so much. I think the budget is always an exercise where we've got many things from very small reforms and changes to very big ones. But I don't think that you can cover everything, especially with the short time span since BJP came into power. For me, one of the key things that is in the budget, but that is not completely covered yet, but where I have big expectations and the investors have big expectations, is GST. And I think this one was mentioned in the budget, and this one will be clearly one of the points that investors will look at to know if BJP is effectively able to put in place changes and reforms that the previous government was not able to do in a few years' time. So effectively, that commitment about GST for me is a very important one. The fact that some other promises or commitments are not in the budget, I think is not so much an issue from my point of view. What I'm looking for is effectively the ability of the new government to put in place GST and to convince state government about it.
Very quickly, Lord Desai, looking over the next 8 months and then secondly looking beyond that over the next 4 years, do you think there will be heightened foreign investor interest in India sparked by this budget, but also fueled by expectations that the next budget in February will be even better? Give me a short, sharp answer.
Patience will earn its own rewards. I say to foreign investors, look towards February. Many of these issues, such as subsidies, would be sorted out by then.
In other words,
labor law will be reformed.
In other words, you're saying to investors, learn the art of patience. But you know something? Most investors are usually impatient. You're asking them to go against their natural brain, aren't you? That hand gesture says it all. That, I think, is your British way of saying, c'est la vie. My thanks to all 4 of my guests for joining me.